Welcome everyone to today's seminar. So this is a further education governance update. I'm Catherine Patel. I'm a partner in Buzzacott's charity and not-for-profit team. I'm joined by my colleague Saatchi Blakemore, and we're also delighted to have Chris Patterson with us from the ESFA as well. Just starting off with a little bit of housekeeping for today's webinar. So everyone who's joined is automatically on mute and videos are turned off. We've set aside some time for a Q&A session at the end. So if you do have any questions during the webinar, then please use the Teams Q&A function. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen. Questions that you raise through that function will be kept anonymous. And also, if we don't get round to answering your question specifically, we will respond after the event in our follow-up. Just in terms of that follow-up, we'll circulate the recording of the event, the slides, and as I said, any answers to those questions that we don't have time for. So if we just move on to the agenda for the webinar today. So I'll start off with an introduction to setting the scene to the FE governance framework. Saatchi will then cover some of the more specific elements of the governance side of things, some of those coming from the recent issue of the governance guide, particularly, but some of those challenges, compliance and governance challenges coming up at the moment. And then Chris will then look at the College Financial Handbook. So the Financial Handbook issued in March this year that becomes relevant from the 1st of August this year. So Chris is going to give some background to that in terms of its introduction and covering some of the requirements of the handbook. And as I said, at the end, we'll then have a Q&A session, 5 minutes or so probably, but we will cover all questions in our follow-up, as I said. So aiming to close by about 12:30. So really, if we firstly move on to setting the scene, I'll just give an overview really of the requirements for governors within colleges and looking at some of the governance codes within there and how that feeds in to the DFE's governance guide and the College Financial Handbook very briefly at the end. So if we just move on to the next slide. So in terms of the governance codes, governing bodies have a choice of 3 governance codes to adopt under the requirements of the College Financial Handbook. So it's a must requirement, as the handbook was issued in March 24, that the college governors must decide on one of the 3 codes here that are set out. So the AOC Code of Good Governance, the Charity Governance Code, or the UK Corporate Governance Code. And colleges must adopt the code that best reflects their legal structure and operations. And really what the DFE, ESFA have also done is taken those governance themes and gone into much more detail from those codes and have made reference to the codes both within the FE and Sixth Form College Corporations Governance Guide that came in February 24, and then, as I've mentioned, the College Financial Handbook that was issued in March this year. So the principles coming through in those governance codes, absolutely key in setting a lot of the principles that the sector works with and has done over numerous years, but really bringing this into focus under the 2 new documents. So if we just move to the next slide. So really, in terms of the role of the governors, the role of the board in all of this. So firstly, selecting that governance code and also adhering to the governance guide as well. So the governance guide includes various must requirements. There are other should requirements or should clauses within there. So the should being the best practice, all of those areas to be considered by the governors as well, and certainly where relevant to the specific college. Also having reference to the regulatory framework, so very important here is that governors adhere to and understand the requirements of the instrument and articles of government for the college and the standing orders also, and both of these mentioned specifically in all governance documents, particularly the governance guide. And the governance guide sets 4 core functions for the governors. So obviously in terms of the college's educational character, so determining that educational character, subsequently preserving that and developing that as the college moves forward. Setting and communicating strategy and goals for the college, And then looking at the leadership, so holding the executive leaders to account for the educational performance and quality of the college, and also the performance of its staff members as well. And then coming on to the sort of the control environment, so the effective control to ensure that the funds and assets of the college are protected and that the college remains solvent, so that financial sustainability of the college, and that obviously the legal and regulatory requirements are being met. All of those obligations are being met, and you'll see that coming through in the various documents as well, and obviously goes without saying that the governors have to ensure that regulatory compliance. There's reference here as well in the governance guide in the introduction to the 6 duties under charity law, and these very much feed through into the various codes, the 3 codes that we'll look at in a little bit more detail. But in terms of those 6 duties, what are they? So undertaking the specific charitable purpose for which the college was set up. So the college is providing public benefit. Obviously, colleges set up principally to provide further and higher education, secondary education for those over 14 years old, and the ancillary goods, services in connection with that purpose. So very much operating within that remit, within that charitable purpose. That the college must comply with its own governing documents, instrument and articles, as I mentioned, and the relevant laws and regulations. So as a governor, do you know what those are? Have you read the instrument and articles? Do you understand the legal and regulatory environment? That you have to act in the best interests of the college, so in the best interests of the students, the beneficiaries of the college, and that you're managing resources responsibly. So very much linking into the 4th core function there as set out under the governance code. That you act with reasonable skill and care, and also that the corporation of the college is accountable as well. And accountability comes through very much in the governance codes, really important there. And that also links to the Nolan Principles of Public Life. Reference to these again in a number of the codes, and absolutely core in terms of some of the phrases being used in all of the codes. The Nolan principles being selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. So sort of value driven as well here in terms of how a governor is expected to act. And as I said, you'll see these themes repeated many times within the governance codes as well. So we'll just take a brief look at the governance code, spending a little bit more time on the AOC FE Code of Good Governance. Probably colleges will see that as the most relevant code of governance to follow. So if we just move to the next slide, please. So really this is covering all those undertaking FE provisions. So it includes and is relevant for 6th form colleges as well as general FE, designated institutions, and also specialist provision as well. So both post 16 and adult education is covered by the AOC code. It was created in consultation with the sector, so is very much FE specific. So intended to be pillars of effective governance and not deemed to be a checklist approach. However, it does have, it's set out in a tabular format for each of the 6 governance principles, and in there are some very useful recommended practice steps, suggested sources of assurance as well. So it is really, it's quite user friendly, and you can see the applicability of that to the FE sector. So just looking at those 6 governance principles here under the AOC code, the first of those is around organisational aims and strategic oversight. So this looks at areas such as setting behaviours, core values, strategic aims, looking at the risks, the key outcomes that you want to drive for your student body, putting those students first in what you're doing, promoting ED&I, the ESG side of things as well. We then have responsibility and accountability. So again, you can see here that accountability phrase. So one of the Nolan principles. So this is delivery of that strategic aim through efficient, effective use of resources, and supporting and holding to account the senior leadership team. So as a governor, you're not going to be running the college on a day-to-day basis and part of that leadership team, but really making sure that you are supporting and challenging as required. Ultimately, the board takes that responsibility and has to be accountable to all of its stakeholders. So here, looking at things like KPIs, self-assessment reviews, risk management, results of inspections, internal audits, etc. And then we move on to leadership and integrity. So integrity, again, a key word that comes through in all of those governance codes. This is around the objective and informed decision making for the benefit of the student population of the college. So the highest levels of professional integrity, conduct, reference to diversity here, codes of conduct, the Nolan principles, and the external governance reviews as well. We then look at collaboration, stakeholder engagement. So really, how well are you meeting the local skills needs as a college? Do you understand those local skills needs, considering the wider group of stakeholders? So not just the students here, but looking at surveys of local employers, the local skills improvement plans, impact assessments, really understanding what you're doing to engage with the stakeholders. And then regulatory compliance, which we've already mentioned, but the boards must comply with the legal and regulatory frameworks. How do you know as a governor that that is happening? Do you know the framework that you're operating under? So things like safeguarding, data protection, financial regulations, whistleblowing, employment law, etc., all coming through here. Assurance and audit process is valuable in this area. And then finally, the board and organisational effectiveness. So looking here at the skill set of the board to ensure strong leadership, direction, the scrutiny balanced with the support, but also the challenge as well, so that this is all based on evidence-based decision making as a board, that you're getting that information from your leadership team in order to make strong decisions. So here, needing that scheme of delegation, terms of reference, good governance structures, governor training, making sure you've got that broad skill set on the board as well. Template linked here within the slides, and as I mentioned, yeah, much reference here to the Nolan principles again. So if we just move slides onto the charity governance code, and I'm not going to say very much here at all, but 7 principles for this code, very similar to those of the AOC code, and again drawing out the Nolan principles. More recent updates to the Charity Governance Code have focused more on the ED&I principle here within section 6. So with the addition of inclusion here as well. So really making sure that those that are following the code are bearing in mind all of the requirements on the ED&I side. Relevant to colleges in that they are usually exempt charities, but also for designated institutions that they are registered charities. So less specific to FE than the AOC code, but still relevant in many ways. And then finally, on the next slide, we have the UK Corporate Governance Code. So really, this is applicable insofar as it applies to college corporations as charities, as exempt or registered charities. Again, many similar themes coming through here. The emphasis of focus for this code is slightly different given the corporate nature of it. So there will be areas within the UK Corporate Governance Code that you don't deem to be applicable to the college. But it also, even if you're not following this code, it actually includes some really useful reference materials. So for example, here you have the section on remuneration. So looking at some of the principles there around setting senior pay, leadership pay might be relevant there, even though you're not sort of formally aligning yourself and adopting this code. So you can see, again, many similar themes coming through here around leadership, responsibilities, accountability, evaluation. Specifically here, and it does come through in other codes, but very specifically here around audit, risk and internal control as well, much of which links in to the DFE and ESFA's guidance as well around the governance guide and also the College Financial Handbook. So you can see how a lot of these themes have been developed further into the more detailed guidance for the sector. So if we just now turn to my final slide around the governance guide. So this was issued in February of this year. Really comprehensive document, bringing together a lot of the principles of the governance codes and then taking those further in terms of the requirements and best practice as well for the sector. So I just wanted to highlight a few points here before I hand over to Saatchi. So just drawing out here a section early on in the document around roles within the board. So detail here around the role of the chair of the corporation, and also the governance professional as well, obviously absolutely critical in terms of the overall adoption of a governance code and how the board is ensuring that it complies with all relevant guidance. So this will be the director or head of governance, or potentially called the clerk, really leading on the governance aspects for the college in providing that guidance and support to the board. There are requirements around the levels of experience and qualifications for that governance professional. Managing conflicts of interest comes in very strongly in many governance guides. So when we're looking at the charity sector as well, the Charity Code of Governance, a lot of focus from principal regulators and government around the requirement for organisations to manage conflicts of interest well. So making sure, for example, you have that conflicts of interest policy, you're ensuring that governors are regularly declaring their potential conflicts, other organisations in which they maybe have a role, a link, to ensure that the college can manage those potential conflicts well and effectively. ED&I I've already mentioned, but there's also a section on ED&I within the governance code. Various further reference documents are linked to that. But as governors, you must have due regard for the need to eliminate discrimination within the college and advance equality of opportunity. So really recommending that the board develops a clear strategy for promoting ED&I throughout the organisation. Fraud and cyber security, a really hot topic, continues to be, has been for the past few years, but continues to be a big risk for the sector. And as Saatchi will say a little bit more on that. And linking back to those 4 areas of core focus: financial sustainability and solvency. So more information here and guidance here for college governors in terms of what's expected to ensure the financial sustainability and solvency of the college. And Saatchi will say a little bit more here because it links into reserves management as well. And also in terms of risk management and how that is being managed. Risk management, really ensuring that you do use your risk register to ensure that the board has an understanding of the key risks facing the college and how they are being managed and mitigated. And then just finally, in terms of the external governance review, this came in a few years ago. So colleges must commission an external governance review every 3 years with an interim annual governance self-assessment. So year 1, you'll have the external review, and then the subsequent years 2 and 3, you just do an annual governance self-assessment internally to then go back in year 4 to have the external governance review. And that should be framed around the key principles of the governance code that the college has specifically adopted, and you must report on that within your annual report and financial statements. You may need to share the findings of that review with the DFE if requested, and that's specifically included within the governance guide. And all of this feeds into the College Financial Handbook. Chris will say more on that, so I won't say any more at this point. But firstly, before Chris looks at the College Financial Handbook, I'll hand over to Saatchi, and she'll look specifically at some of the more complex areas of governance compliance. So over to you, Saatchi. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Catherine. So I actually wanted to cover 4 topics, but sort of go into them in a bit more detail and with a view to giving you some practical examples of what good practice looks like in those areas. I think these 4 areas certainly are areas worth, from a governance perspective, as a governor audit committee member, areas potentially for greater challenge and probing. And from management's perspective, it's an area where there could be an element of a bit more forward planning if it's appropriate for the college. So next slide, please. The 4 topics I really did want to concentrate on was cyber risk, trading activities within a college, reserves policy, and auditors' findings. And it's safe to say these aren't new topics. These are the reason I wanted to give it more attention is that I think it's fair to say for some of them the risk has increased for the organisation. You now have more explicit guidance in the form of the College Financial Handbook, governance guide. You've got an element of greater external scrutiny, particularly something like when a cyber incident happens, for example, or even in some cases, when I'll talk about trading entities, HMRC, and there's specific rules now based on NPM rules, value for money rules, that you can and can't do certain things. So all of that means that there is more at stake for colleges, particularly in relation to these areas. So if I can move on to the next slide, please. It's in relation to cybersecurity, and I think it's a fair thing to say that certainly almost all colleges and their governing bodies and senior executives deem this area to be high risk for colleges. But of course, with this particular area, and you could sort of replace the word cyber with fraud, they're interchangeable. The principles I talk about are the same. Is that, it's what I call a roadrunner analogy, where the cartoon, the roadrunner keeps running, and the sort of, as he's running, the road keeps falling. You're always having to keep on top of trying to manage this risk, because as cyber criminals get more and more clever about things, you need more arsenal to basically help you keep up to speed. And the risk is very high for colleges, really. There's sort of 3 reasons why colleges and other educational organisations are at high risk. Is, first of all, you've got lots and lots of users, lots of students, staff, etc., but they also have multiple devices, so greater data entry point. You also have lots of personal data, well, again, students, staff, etc. The third sector as a whole, there's a perception amongst cyber criminals that you don't have large budgets like corporates do, and therefore there's a sort of an inherent weakness in the system that enables them to get through. The impact, as you all know from experience of other colleges, universities, academy trusts that are in the public domain, has been significant, both in terms of finances and reputation. But actually, there's the other element, which is the operational side, and certainly organisations have had to shut down for weeks on end just to clear out, make clean the devices that are held in the organisation. I think it's absolutely fair to say, certainly most colleges that we work with have, as I said, they accept it's high risk, and they've got tools and approaches to dealing with this. Whether it's, I think what's common is certainly regular reviews, sort of an external or an internal audit, by a third party who looks at cybersecurity is really quite common, and it's done on a fairly sort of regular basis. Insurance, accreditation, all of that are very much common now to the sector. But I would say that where each college is very much dependent on their own risk, but also more importantly, their finances, priorities and resources. For some organisations, they have all of those elements lined up, and therefore they can devote more time and resources. And for others, that they're not quite as progressed in their journey as they'd like to be. What I would say, and I think particularly in light of what's happened with British Library, I've certainly seen the tone of conversation at audit committees has become a lot more serious. What is developing into really good practice is, rather than focus on the actions, the mitigating actions, what do we need to do, how do we do it, this is what other colleges are doing, that all worked well when it all first started to happen 3-4 years ago in terms of attacks, is a much more proactive approach that audit committees are really taking with the leadership team. And that's actually really engaging with the risk discussions. I have seen some excellent risk discussions being in some ways, the information is presented by the head of IT, the CTO of the college, to board members to say, this is the specific risk to our college. This is what we're doing to mitigate it. This is what more we can actually do, but it comes at a cost. And the conversation around what you do is led from that perspective. So it's risk-led rather than a sort of an action-led approach. And I think if I can go to the next slide to demonstrate that that's exactly what the ESFA has. And it talks about in the governance guide that it should really be led by the risk management for the organisation. The other topic I wanted to talk about was, next slide, please, was trading activities. So some colleges will have subsidiary entities. There will be the college at the top, but perhaps 2 or 3 or even maybe a single subsidiary entity that undertakes specific activities. And you can divide in a very simplistic way those subsidiaries into sort of 2 camps. The first camp is what I call trading entities. And Catherine, right at the start, talked about what is the college's objectives around the primary purpose of delivering education, the ancillary, which is services related to that education. But then there's also the third element, is that the college has an incredible estate that it could use, or indeed other things it can use within its sort of infrastructure to help it generate revenue. Typically for colleges, it will be things, I don't know, sort of perhaps a college gym is also available to the public at certain times for a commercial rate, or the car park is available for users at the weekend, and local football stadium, etc. It helps bring in revenue at a time when the premises are not being used for the college's activities, educational activities. And that's just an example of what a trading activity looks like. Now, there is a requirement, and this is an HMRC-led requirement, is that if your trading activity, those things that are not related to education, exceeds 80,000 in revenue, then you actually need to put it into a separate entity, and then any profits generated within that separate entity actually go back to the college. So it's circular, but it is a requirement. So that's one group of subsidiary entities I'm talking about. And then for other colleges, there may well be entities which are set up for commercial reasons. So, and it's not to do with the trading activity. So, for example, there will be, for commercial reasons, some colleges have set up a company that undertakes all the sort of cleaning work at the college, the catering, the security, etc. The point I'm trying to emphasize is more in relation to the former, the trading element, but in principle, you could also apply it to the other subsidiaries. So the main thing is, you as a college decide you're going to undertake these activities, trading activities, to help generate profit for the college. So the question is, what if your trading entity actually makes a loss? Now, there are you can again look at it from 2 perspectives. One is what I call short-term losses, and a good example of that was during the pandemic, where the college facilities couldn't be used. It had certain costs it had to meet, and therefore for a couple of years some trading entities actually made a loss. But it was a sort of a short-term thing, and many are now in a process of gradually coming out of that, and the commercial activities are going up. So a short-term loss situation. The other is a longer term situation where year on year the trading entity simply doesn't make a profit and continues to make a loss, and it's very difficult to then assess when will it return to profitable trading. So there is a bigger question here. If your purpose is to have this entity to help you basically add to your funds available for education, and you keep pouring money into an entity that's loss making, should you be doing that? That's a fundamental question that all governors should be engaging with. It's because ultimately, if you're not, then it's apart from being a regularity breach, you're not doing your primary role, which is first and foremost, you're putting the interests of the college at heart. But in the interim, also, if you think about the setup, whilst an entity is making loss, it's effectively the college that's having to finance it, whether it's a sort of a working capital loan or possibly even a slightly longer term loan. Now, under the new rules of reclassification of colleges, basically one of the rules is you can no longer just actually say, well, it's fine, that entity is going to continue for a while, the college is going to support it. If you're going to go down the route of giving it a letter of comfort, letter of guarantee, you need to get permission from the ESFA first. Secondly, if you decide that some of that loan ought to be written off because it's going to be a bit of time before that trading entity starts to make a profit, again, the NPM rules means you have to ask the permission of the ESFA first. So I think that's the other key thing is to make sure that you're lining up the steps before the breach actually happens. And I think the last thing I would say on this, it's obviously the ESFA is critical in terms of whether you proceed with this and you get their permission, etc. But there are other elements where management can actually take professional advice proactively to help minimize the risk. So, you know, speaking to the lawyers about what activities are going through the trading company is a good piece, because it might be some of those activities could fall under the definition of ancillary, or, you know, could be part of the college's activities. We sometimes get asked, is it okay if I don't, you know, college doesn't recharge costs across to the trading entity? And the answer is it's not quite as simple as that, because the taxman, HMRC, might have a different view if you decide to sort of, you know, deviate from what you do in terms of recharges. And of course, it might be okay, but the key thing is you do need to take professional advice. And I think the onus is really twofold: for governors to really assess the financial viability of those companies and agree what's best with management, but also for management to take professional advice as needed if they perceive that those trading entities may, at least either in the short term or long term, not be financially viable. Next slide, please. And I think, in fact, on the next two slides, I've just set out references both from the College Financial Handbook that emphasises the point that actually you do need to speak to the ESFA around supporting loss-making entities, which is the reference here. And on the next slide, it's from the governance guide, which is sort of really asking the governors to engage with what is the motive in having a trading subsidiary, because if it's loss making, then you may not be doing a service to the college. On the next topic is around reserves policy. So there is now explicit reference in the College Financial Handbook that colleges need to have a reserves policy. What is reserves for colleges? Reserves are really, in essence, monies that are available at any given point to the management and the governors to make a decision where they want to use those funds. It's your savings pot, and typically for colleges it will be the working capital. You would exclude things like your estate, your fixed assets, because you can't convert that into cash easily. But equally, you would exclude your long-term pension liability, because it is long-term. This is much more about what's readily available to the organisation. As I said, typically for colleges, it will tend to be working capital. Where I would say this is one area, I think the FE sector has a little bit of catching up with charities, but also academies. The guidance now is colleges should, and I emphasise the word should, because in the academy sector, in the charity sector, it's a must. You need to have a policy, a reserves policy, by which I mean a level of reserves that you aspire to hold. And aside from it being a sort of a requirement, if you sort of reflect on what it's intended to do, if you want good financial management, if you want to be able to assess your going concern basis, you really need to know what is it that you're storing for your, you know, what I call a rainy day or future plans planning. What is it that I need to have? Without that as a guide, it does make financial planning very difficult, and particularly in this economic climate where costs are really rising, having a policy is like a rudder on a sailboat. You can always keep coming back to it. Where are we and where are we going? So I think the discussion certainly should be at committees, governance level and management, is what is the right policy for the college. It's a question that I've heard from charities for the last 20 years. I often get, well, what do you think should be our policy? And of course, it's not as simple as actually saying this is what what the policy is. It's not a formulaic approach. It's both an art and a science, and it's really thinking about what are the risks to your college. What is your own cash flow requirement for the college? Do you have an element of contingency built in? And of course, the last 4 years just demonstrates that all of us need to build in contingency for things that we don't foresee. And what are your future plans in terms of investing in your IT, in your capital, etc.? And then you come up with a policy. And if it might be that at the moment there isn't explicit guidance for FE colleges around what that number might look like, but if I can give you a reference, I think certainly for academy trusts, which are cousins, I appreciate we're not comparing the same colleges with academy trusts, but the ESFA certainly in the last couple of years has suggested, look, if you're holding anything less than 5% of your operational income to academy trusts, possibly too low. And if you're holding anything more than 20%, possibly too high. But again, it's not as black and white. So I think really key that I think college boards think about what's relevant for them in the context of your own risks, your own budget, and your sort of annual plans coming out for the next 2 to 3 years. The final point I wanted to make, and I'll hand over to Chris, is just in relation to auditors' findings. Again, this emphasises that boards must ensure timely response to audit findings. And you are all aware that the audit report issued by the external auditors, us, is also submitted to the ESFA each year. I think most colleges are very good with following up, and most audit committees are in terms of findings. Probably, although what I would say is that there is a sort of, in some ways, I'm beginning to see kind of a noticeable creep for some organisations where there's an accumulation of issues. So prior issues that are raised don't get dealt with. There's more issues that you're making recommendations on. Perfectly valid reasons, I think, in the last 4 years, initially with sort of COVID, remote working, investment in systems, all of that, and then coming out of COVID and finding there's not enough finance personnel or personnel full stop. And colleges are finding it hard to recruit. So all of that makes it difficult for certain things to get addressed in the way they used to. So yes, it's reasonable to see more things being reported in the post-audit report. But what I would say, and this is really important, is that I think it's very important for audit committees in particular to understand what recommendations are actually structural issues that now need to be addressed in a different response, and what are sort of one-off issues, because it's easy to conflate with everything that's gone on. It's easy to say, oh yes, but it's it's everything that's happened the last few years, that's why we can't deal with it. I think, and in order to do that, my suggestion is when you get a report from us, is some of the key things you ought to be considering to assess whether some of the issues are structural or they're actually you can be assured they're one-off, is, are we raising the number of points we're raising? How many of those are ongoing from the previous year? What is the rating we're giving them? Are there lots of adjustments we're proposing in our report to the numbers? What is the commentary under the regularity qualification? Are there any breaches that we're highlighting? And take that not just in isolation, because if there are structural issues, you should get a theme coming through from the internal audit findings. They may likely be saying something very similar. There might be something around financial health assessment. There might be the sort of similar themes coming through from the funding audits. So I think if it's quite imperative that audit committees think about what's being presented, and then check the progress is being undertaken on a timely basis. I've said quite a bit, so I will now finish my session and hand over to Chris.
Well, thank you, Sharchi. So yes, Welcome everybody, and just I'm going to speak for a few minutes about the College Financial Handbook. It's kind of been the one of the main elements of my work, I think, for the last almost year or so, I think, basically. So it's quite important. I think it's been referenced, I think, through the other speakers, and depending where you are, where you sit in the college, whether you're part of executive management, finance, governance, I think there's something in it for all of you, really. So if we could move on to the next slide, please, just to what I aim to cover today. So I'm going to set out a little bit of the background to how we got to where we are today in relation to the handbook, what the purpose of it is. I'm going to spend a little bit of time on the content, but I think probably quite high level. Turn next to what might happen next with the handbook and the kind of ancillary financial framework type documents which we have for the college sector. And then, as Catherine said, there'll be an opportunity for some questions towards the end. So next slide, please. So cast your mind back, November 2022, that was the day on, well, 29th of November 22, that was the day on which the Office for National Statistics made its notification that the college sector was going to be reclassified to central government. We in the agency, we had a little bit of notice of that, not a massive amount. I think we had more notice. We probably would have had more of an endeavour to get a handbook ready for day one, but we didn't have that opportunity. So what we did have was a Dear Accounting Officer letter on day one, and we followed that up in early 23 with what we call 6 bite-sized guides, which were bits of thematic guidance to some of the elements of financial management which had changed for the college sector. However, that was only ever going to be kind of a temporary fix, and in the spring summer last year we started the work on the drafting of the handbook. By autumn last year we'd got a final draft which we'd impacted for feedback from the sector, and then going through the various internal sign-offs, we published on the 20th of March, so that's just last month, isn't it? Which that was again notified in the ESFA weekly update, and there was another Dear Accounting Officer letter to college leaders. And then, as was mentioned before through Catherine, the handbook doesn't come into effect itself until the 1st of August 24. So you've got a few months. So next slide. So you might be asking yourself, why a handbook at all? Well, all of our work in the funding agency is framed in terms of the 3 key themes of certainty, support, and assurance. And you'll see certainty is quite important. Obviously, we had brought out the Dear Accounting, so brought out the thematic bite-sized guides. But the feedback I think we got from the sector was they seemed a little bit ephemeral. They wanted something which is more definitive. So we did. The handbook is supposed to be a definitive guidance to financial management and control in the college sector. Also certainty in respect of the fact that with effect from 1st of August 24, so the next academic year, compliance with the handbook will be a requirement of the college accountability agreement. So again, that's again, it's, as it has been said, I think there's a mixture of musts and shoulds in the handbook, but the musts will become basically requirements of compliance with the accountability agreement. Support, yes, yeah, I like that. I like that phrase before, that colleges and academies are cousins. Quite, I kind of resonated something a little bit, because a lot of what we were told when we were engaging with the sector to develop the handbook was that we're not big schools, don't you? We know we're different to academies. Yes, we did know that, and it was really important to us that we recognised the sector's diversity, really important, but also that we were working with a crowd of really good people from the sector, many of which came to us with great ideas, and it was very important that we used the handbook not just to set out the musts, but to set out some of the good practice as well. And I think that some of that feeds into some of the earlier discussion about governance. Very much a joint enterprise with the sector. And assurance, yes, it's all about control. It's all about being part of the government sector now. So it's about proper use of public funds. A lot of that resonates or meshes really with some of the charitable principles, I think, which we've already mentioned. For governors, I think that's probably quite an important theme, and that feeds through to our own responsibility as the funding agency, our responsibility to Parliament in respect of the proper use of public funds. So next slide, please. This isn't something which the funding agency developed in isolation. It was really important to us to land the handbook, that it was a product which was developed jointly with the sector and spoke to the sector in its own language. So, and a lot of that, obviously, that takes time. You can write a handbook, can't you? But to get one which actually resonates and which lands, you've got to spend a bit of time talking to people, and that's what we did. So, in this time last year, we set up our working party, and that involved chief financial officers from 10 colleges, and that was a blend of all types of colleges, big FE corporations, sixth form colleges, different geographic spreads, big college groups, smaller colleges as well. We worked with the main college representative bodies. Thanks particularly, I think, to the Association of Colleges and the Sixth Form College Association, both of which really did roll the sleeves up and get involved and help us. National Governance Professionals Group, again, feeding into earlier discussions about the importance of the governance professional in the corporate governance of college corporations. We did have very strong representation from the college governance professionals in the development of the handbook. And I think a lot of the kind of procedural stuff which we've got in the handbook, that was very much influenced by some thinking from the governance professionals we work with. Catholic Education Service were there as well, and I think they had some specific areas which related to the governance of Catholic sixth form colleges. We took that into account. But we worked with the audit firms as well, and Buzzacott, again, a trusted partner really for us for the Education and Skills Funding Agency, who we work with through our audit forum. It was really important to get the audits on board. We took the working party through 3 sets of meetings. So basically you do a draft, you take the meeting, you discuss it, you change it, etc. So that's what we did really over the whole of the summer last year. And that engagement process was complete by about September last year. So if we go to the next slide, please. What did the sector tell us? They said, we don't want lots of detail. Don't tell us how to do our jobs. Just tell us what you need us to do. So basically, it's a principles-based document. You won't get into the weeds with a lot of detail. You've got to deal with it in basic principles. As I said before, it's very sector-specific. Sector also wanted us to bring together existing elements which were already there as part of the college framework. So, for instance, the stuff which we've already mentioned, the charitable rules, the governance codes, procurement law, that was already there. The new stuff which came out of the specifically being moved into the central government body, which was the new rules which come from management of public money, and that's to do with various restrictions, thresholds, permissions, etc. Governance. I think in the earlier discussion about governance, we talked about the kind of difference between the role of the board and that of executive management. I think that is referenced in the handbook, but in the handbook we do go quite large on the duties and responsibilities of the accounting officer. That's a bit of a central government specific thing, and I would think it's possibly something I would recommend people to have a little bit of a think about, the specific roles and responsibilities there which come with being a college leader and the expectations of being in central government. As I mentioned, also best practice there. So for instance, we've referenced things like the Further Education Commissioner guidance on various areas, and we provide links to other resources as well. The sector also told us, yes, it's great to have a handbook, but there's lots of other good stuff out there as well. Chris, can you do your best to simplify some of that? We were told ultimately that it was a good product and that there were no surprises. And I think basically, you know, you develop a product like this. I think if you can get feedback like that from the sector, then I think that's something as a funding agency we were quite content with. Next slide. I think we've got it repeated. So I think we go to the content slide, please. Yeah. So this is basically the contents of the handbook. It comes in, we have an introduction and we have 6 main sections. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of detail here, but just to give you a flavour of what's in the book. So introduction, we've got stuff there in, you know, it's basically matters of scope and terminology, that sort of thing, who the handbook's for, who it's not for, how it fits with the rest of the framework. We then move on to roles and responsibilities. So again, there's a mesh there, isn't there, with what we were discussing earlier on corporate governance. I've already mentioned the accounting officer. There's also reference there to the role of the chief financial officer. Obviously, it's a financial handbook, so that's one, you know, the main readership read, I suppose, in many ways. Part 3 is what we call main financial requirements. Again, this is very, very principles based. It's just about the issues of the normal stuff of governance, avoiding conflicts of interest, risk management, etc. All the stuff I guess you would expect to see in any well-run organisation. So I think that's probably one of the reasons why when we went through this, we got the feedback, no surprises. Section 3, audit committee and internal review. There's a little bit there, I think, of an overlap with the post-16 audit code of practice, but we're looking to rationalise that going forward. So there might be some more change next year. Section 4, again, nothing new. It's the existing requirements regarding annual accounts and audit. A little bit there about internal review, as we call it. The review of irregularity, again, something I would probably put a little bit of a emphasis on that. The responsibility of the accounting officer for regularity, and you know, I would recommend you do have a read of that. 5 is kind of where we get into the detail, and it's to do with all the various delegated authorities. So, for instance, as was mentioned previously, there are rules and thresholds now over things like losses and write-offs, letters of comfort, etc. In some of these areas, the college can kind of get on and carry on and make its decisions on its own authority. In others, whereby it's necessary for if you're going to go over one of these particular thresholds, you've got to come to us and ask for approval before you get there. So again, some of that is quite finely calibrated. Again, I would expect college financial departments having a look at that and doing their best to ensure that their own internal financial regulations and procedures track what the requirements are. Finally, at the end, a little bit about the role of the regulator in intervention. This is pretty light. The handbook isn't about stern messages about what, you know, if you don't obey the rules, this is what we'll do. We're not trying to do that in the handbook. What we're trying to do is basically steer you through what the requirements are. I mean, there's already a framework for oversight and intervention, and the handbook doesn't add to that. So just move on to the next slide, please. So I guess at the beginning of the process, working with our representative delegates, there was made perception what the handbook, what it would be, and what it would not. And I think this slide really captures, I would hope, the essence of the handbook, principles developed in partnership with the sector, a blend of musts and shoulds, codification of some of the existing requirements, and not a long document either, only 50 pages, quite a lot of white space there as well. So I kind of the benchmark I set for myself would be if I could keep it under 50, and if it was one of those documents whereby if you were on a train journey, is it the kind of thing where you could get through in a couple of hours? I would say it would be. Print it off and have a read of it would be my recommendation. What it's not a series of lists. It doesn't replace the college's own internal financial regulations. We're not going to lift the lid on our internal machinations in ESFA and DFE. Basically, if we say something like you need to come for us for approval, that's what you need to do. We're not going to sort of say, and these are our, our internal authorities. That's not what it's about. It's not about non-compliance, as I said earlier and I don't think there are lots of surprises about either. So that was my view. And then if we move to the next slide, we didn't get a reaction from the sector press within the day, or sorry, on the week of release, but that came 2 or 3 weeks later, and and the headline here was making the best of a bad job, and I've gone, well, that's kind of, wow, faint praise indeed. But that's the headline. But I think we looked further down the article, and I think there's the 4 bullet points there, which I've got on the left, the right hand side of that slide. I think they possibly give a slightly more nuanced interpretation of what the handbook is. Done a good job of none of them look fairly limiting. It's unfairly limiting. So I think, the college may not, the sector may not have welcomed reclassification, but the reclassification has happened, and it was important for us in the funding agency. We landed this for the sector, and we try to make it as pain-free as possible. So next slide. What happens next? Well, I've already mentioned the handbook becomes effective from the 1st of August. And from that point on, it will then become integrated with the accountability agreements and also with the oversight, support and intervention framework. So colleges have got a few months to familiarise themselves, to have a look at their existing procedures, to ensure that they're compliant, and should all be ready by August. It's really important to us that we continue to have feedback from the sector and dialogue. So your questions here today are really important. We intend to develop further best practice. So I'm currently working on some thematic guidance which might flesh out some of the issues which we've set out in the handbook with what I'm calling case studies. So watch this space. I'm hoping to get those out maybe by the beginning of the next academic year. And then probably an annual review of the handbook. This is our first edition. Is it perfect? Well, it's the best we could make it in the time we had, but no doubt we'll get feedback, and we'll probably need to, knock a few rough edges off it, I think, possibly. And policy changes as well, doesn't the environment changes? So we will need to think about keeping it up to date and make sure that it doesn't go stale over time. So that's me, and I think, Catherine, that means back to you, doesn't it?
Great. Thanks so much, Chris. Yeah, no, really good. Thank you. We've got about 5 minutes for questions. So if I just take them in turn in terms of the ones that have come through. So the first question, they're related to wholly owned subsidiaries. So asking whether the directors of the subsidiary have to apply the governance code, financial handbook, governance guide, etc. I mean, from my perspective, Chris, you might want to add into this, and Saatchi. I mean, the directors are responsible for the company, but overall, the board is responsible for the group of a wholly owned subsidiary. So in my view, the directors have to be aware of those ESFA requirements, all of the governance code, etc., but don't have to specifically report on that. But certainly some of the points that Saatchi set out, where there may be increased complexity, then the director should absolutely be aware of those, because ultimately they do form part of the college and the charitable group. Chris or Saatchi, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, Catherine, I think the only thing I would add to that would be yes, I mean, the ONS was very specific about the fact that the subsidiaries themselves were classified and are considered part of the sector. So the handbook most definitely applies directly in relation to the subsidiaries. I think possibly the other little bit of nuance is that as directors, of course, there's the real obligations in addition to those which we've mentioned previously, which were to do with charitable obligations. For instance, we've got, obviously you've got company law obligations as well, which kick in as well. So that's something to think about, I suppose.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. So the next question was around the reserves policy, and just in terms of developing and approving the reserves policy, then where would we expect that would be presented? So really the passage before the board, is that through the audit or the finance committee? Saatchi, do you want to comment on that one?
Yeah, I think I would say actually the finance committee, because they're looking at the overall picture of the financial planning, the direction of financial travel. and they will be in a better position to make well, it be management that devises the policy, but the committee then considers it and challenges it. I'm not saying sort of belts and braces, but equally, if you've got the timing right, the audit committee can also look at it. But I think the real value and the challenge will come from the finance committee before it goes to the board, is my suggestion, really.
Great, thank you, Sachi. The next question related to a specific clause within the College Financial Handbook. So this is around the setting of executive pay, and the link here, there's mentioned for those colleges registered with the OFS and therefore the sort of the link with the Higher Education Code. I mean, before looking at that one specifically, in terms of the overview of selecting a governance code, and ultimately, if you were to select the AOC code, what the AOC governance code is saying is it's consistent with the OFS conditions of registration concerning management and governance, but that colleges who are registered with the OFS would still need to comply with the relevant conditions of registration, and the adoption of the AOC code doesn't replace that. So that's sort of the general point that the AOC is making. In terms of specifically the question on the exec pay, is a college is required to adopt the CUC code as well as the AOC code, or is it just an alternative? I don't know, Chris, whether you're able to answer that one, or we might need to, whether we need to follow that one up.
I think you put me on the spot there slightly, Catherine.
Sorry,
but I think what I've always, I mean, through my discussions with AOC, their view is basically if you comply with their code, you're already compliant with it. You're already compliant with the CUC code. The question then is whether you need to formally adopt the CUC code as well. Sounds as if you probably do, but I wouldn't worry too much about going through into all the detail to do with what you've got to do to comply, because if you're complying with the OC code, you're going to be complying with the other code as well.
Yeah, we can follow that up as well, specifically on the exec pay in the follow-up. So yeah. And then just time for the very final question around, maybe one for you, Sachi, a question around trading entities. So is it possible / sensible to aggregate all trading activity, ancillary activity into one single trading company?
Yeah. So, Charles, it is possible, but what I would say is because you have this 80,000 threshold in terms of trading activities, and there is actually a distinction between primary purpose, which is the education bit that the college does. Ancillary is things that are related to education. So if you sold, I don't know, pens and pencils and books and stuff like that, and then there is trading, and really the trading entities are for the third category. So if there are elements which are ancillary, you may well be better off keeping them in the college and allowing those activities to go through. But of course, as I said, for sometimes you have a trading subsidiary, not necessarily just because it's a tax compliance issue. You might do it to better report or commercial risks. So I think it's first determining whether you decide to put everything in one entity. Is what is your motive? Is it making sure you comply with the taxman? Is it you want to just show all these activities separately? Is it better from a risk profile? That's the key question, and then attempting to understand what needs to go in the other entity.
Great, thank you very much, Sachi. So I think that brings us to the end of the questions that were raised. So really, just finally to conclude, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Particular thanks as well to Chris for spending time joining our webinar as well. It was really insightful. Thank you very much, Chris. As I said at the outset, we'll be sharing the recording and the slides from today. So they should be coming around shortly after the event. So once again, many thanks for attending.